So I'm super excited that we have a guest in the book barn. My son Shane is here to talk about a Stephen King collection of stories. Shane is currently working at Oklahoma State University doing research and teaching. So Shane, welcome home.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we're going to start off with some questions. The first question is, can you tell us a little about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. Clearly, I'm your son, so I am back home. But now my wife, Sarah, and I, we live in Oklahoma. As you mentioned, I work at Oklahoma State. I get to, work with a lot of young people and run a research lab, which is exciting for me. But at home, we have two daughters who I think will make a guest appearance on the podcast at some point in the future. And
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say that those are kind of the highlights.
All right. Well, can you tell us what sparked your interest in your field?
In my field, I don't know that there was really a point that drove me towards the interest that I have in what I do. It was really just kind of stumbling through university and long story short, wound up in a class with someone who asked, if I wanted to be a participant in a research study. And I said, sure, that sounds great. And then, 8 years later, I was still in that same room with those same people doing research. So truly, it was the people that I was around, loving what they were doing, and that became kind of contagious, and I caught the bug. I've never looked back since then.
So tell me about the three most influential people in your life and how they've impacted you.
The three most influential people, what a question. I think the question is a hard one to answer, but for me, there have been kind of those people who have been pillars, I would say. I don't want to discount. There's probably a 100-way tie for fourth place. But the three most would be the people that I mentioned kind of drug me into the field that I'm in, which would be Dr. Tom Barstow. He was my mentor for many years at Kansas State. And he, for me, is the person that I find myself asking, what would he do in this situation? And so not only did he get me excited about the science that I get to do every day, but his mentorship towards me as a student, I've tried my best to emulate that in the way that I mentor my students. And then he's just a phenomenal person who I do try and model my actions and attitudes and all of those things after. So he's certainly at the top of the list. The next two are friends that I made while I was in school and actually spent a little bit of time after school at Mayo Clinic doing some research up there as well. And those two people would be Dr. Josh Smith and Dr. Andrew Alexander. Again, great colleagues, but more importantly, great friends. Josh was kind of that guy that's always been, 3 or 4 or 5 steps ahead of me in the process of getting the career going. And so he's been someone I can, kind of lean on, ask questions, follow in the footsteps. And then Andrew, he serves as the best friend role, I would say. So I call him often. We talk on the phone all the time. He gives me that perspective piece. So if I think I know something, I call him and he tells me I know nothing. And then if I'm not sure what to do, right, he's the person that I call and he's, there for the advice. So serves an important role in my life for sure.
Well, that's great to have such great inspiration.
Yeah, agreed.
So if you could give your 18-year-old self some advice, what would you say?
Another tough question. If I were to give my 18-year-old self some advice, I think it would be to not worry so much about the little things. And I think that that's a little cliche, and a lot of people may give that answer. But for me, I think there were important moments in time where I was really worried about, doing my best on a certain exam, or maybe, life circumstances were throwing curveballs and things. And looking back, those little moments didn't matter. What did matter was kind of the response. So don't get bogged down in what's going on in the moment. Just worry about your character, making sure you're doing things the right way, and things will work out pretty well.
They do seem to always have a way of working out.
Yeah.
So what's one thing about your career that you didn't expect?
Science as a field is interesting because our job really is to try and make predictions about what's going to happen. And so I think even as my career has unfolded, I've been lucky to be around people who have prepared me really well. So I don't know that anything has been unexpected. But the one thing that I have enjoyed more than I ever could have imagined is the mentorship piece of my job. So I get to work with some young adults who are, like I was, trying to figure out, what is it I want to do? And so trying to be the person that others have been for me, to give them a place where they can get excited about something and kind of explore what interests them and trying to push them in ways that they may not push themselves. It's been really, really fun. I've gotten to meet some really great people, and I would say that that's what's been, again, not unexpected, but just pleasantly has fulfilled all those expectations that I did have.
Oh, yeah, that's great. So I assume that your job requires you to read quite a bit. Is that true?
That's very true. Reading is a huge piece of what I do, and it's interesting because, probably around 4th or 5th grade, sports became kind of the focal point of the quote unquote free time that I had growing up, and so that's, if I remember back, that's probably when I stopped reading. I would read for school and assignments and those sorts of things, but I don't remember reading for enjoyment much through middle school or high school and even early into college, unless it was an assignment. And graduate school and learning what it takes to be a scientist is what really hey, you've got to read every day. You've got to not only read this, 100, 200 years worth of historical science, but you also have to stay up to date. And so reading is something that I should do every day. I don't always hit that mark, but I should do it every day. And I think that reading as part of my job is one of the reasons that reading for enjoyment in my free time is so important, because I always want reading to be something that is something I look forward to, not something that feels like work all the time.
Trying to find a balance there.
Exactly.
Okay, we have some quick ones here.
Yeah, let's do some fun stuff.
Yes. Coffee or tea?
I'm a coffee guy.
Early bird or night owl?
Early bird. I enjoy evening times, I think, more, but I get most of my good work done in the mornings. So
Just like your mom. Dogs or cats?
we are dog people at our house.
One thing you can't live without?
One thing I can't live without. This is a tough one.
So many things, right?
It is. It's so many things. For me, a lot of the enjoyment that I get out of not just reading, but a lot of the hobbies that I have deal with kind of using your imagination and either creating a new space to be in or helping other people use their imaginations. And so the thing that I would be terrified to lose would be my creative engine and my imagination, being able to use my mind.
Oh, yeah, good one.
That is good. What's your go-to comfort food?
Go-to comfort food? Oh, probably anything that is sweet. My wife and I have a rule that if it makes it into the house, I will eat it. And so if she purchases something that tastes particularly good, it's got to be in small quantities.
So summer or winter?
Summer. We spent a couple of years in Minnesota while I was at Mayo Clinic, and the winters up there are true winters.
Yeah, brutal.
They're fun, right? There's a lot of things to do, and snow is a lot of fun, but the driving situation, the impact that a hard winter can have on your life is a little more than I think the summers have on us. And so, being in Oklahoma, we kind of have to now enjoy the summer because
That's what you have.
It's 8 months of the year. Yeah, exactly.
Sweet or savory? And you kind of already answered that.
Yeah, I do have a sweet tooth. I do enjoy a good savory treat, but I've always had a sweet tooth. Yeah, and you know that.
I do.
City or country?
I'm gonna say both, which may surprise Mom. I grew up in the country. I love country life. A lot of my hobbies kind of center around being out in the country, but I enjoy a good trip to a city. One of the things I get to do often, or at least yearly, is go to scientific conferences, and they're always hosted in large U.S. cities. And some of the best times I've had have been in those environments. And I think something being different than the environment that you're used to has a certain appeal to it. So I'll say both.
Yeah.
Okay. What's your favorite way to relax after a long day?
After a long day, if I'm given the opportunity to find some relaxation time, it's usually in a rocking chair with a book and a drink, or I'll hop on the computer and play games with friends that are long distance. That's the one thing that the COVID era kind of gave us, was open the door to a lot of opportunities to do things from a distance. And so some of my favorite things to do is just to rekindle those relationships that haven't been in person for a while.
All right. Do you have a favorite author?
This question is tough. It would be easy for me to dwindle it down to 2 authors, I think. And one of those authors I'm reading right now, and one of those authors is the author of the book that we're going to talk about today. But if I got asked the question, if you could only take the works of one author to a desert island, I think the answer becomes really easy because Stephen King is a guy that I go back to a lot. If he has a new book that comes out, I read it. Even if I don't like it, I'll always read the next one. I just enjoy the way that he writes, and he has so many books available that I don't see myself ever getting tired of reading a Stephen King novel. Now, to give the mention to the other author, to give him some credit, Joe Abercrombie is a fantasy writer, and he has a trilogy called the First Law Trilogy. I think it was the first series of books that I read where I didn't put down 1,000 pages of reading. I think I finished the whole thing in like 2 weeks. It was incredible. And he has a new trilogy that I'm getting into right now. So, yeah, very good.
So, is there a book you wish to see made into a movie?
Yeah, this is controversial because I think so many of us have those books that we consider to be our favorites. But sometimes when they make the movie, I don't want to say it ruins the book. It doesn't ruin the book. It's just you hear other people talk about it and you're like, oh, that's not really how that happened. Or you need to read the book. It's so much better. So there are a couple. Joe Abercrombie wrote a book. It's not one of the books from his trilogy, but it's called Best Served Cold. And it's a revenge story. And it supposedly they're making a movie out of that book in the next few years. And it is one of those where if they do it right, it could be incredible. If they do it poorly, everyone that reads Joe Abercrombie will notice. But to get away from those two, I would say that there's a book called The Hail Mary Project that is it's written by the same person that wrote The Martian, and it is said to be being made into a movie as well. So I'm excited about that.
Oh yeah. Where is your favorite place to read?
Well, the place I read the most often, we'll start there, is in the office in our house. We have a rocking chair set up, and it's kind of in the corner. It's nice. It's quiet. We have 2 children, create some chaos in the house. So if you want to go read a book, that's a pretty good spot. My favorite place I've ever read a book is probably on a beach. We took a trip, my wife and I, to Florida a couple of years ago, and I remember I finished an entire book one day just sitting on the beach, and very nice, very relaxing
that
place.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah, a little bit
heavenly,
of a dream. Yep.
Okay. What book will we be discussing today?
The book I have here with me today is called You Like It Darker. And it is a series of short stories that was written by Stephen King. It came out this year in May. Really quickly after it came out, I knew I had to grab it because so many of Stephen King's fans and critics, one of the things they've kind of gotten onto him about is he hasn't really written in the last decade those iconic true horror stories. And so, the title was a little bit of an attention grabber for me because I was thinking, oh man, somewhere in here there's going to be some of those old classic horror type stories that he's so well known for. So
I have a confession. I've never read any Stephen King until I knew we were discussing this book.
I have not watched the movies.
Yeah. So I thought maybe I ought to try, get a little sampling of him. Short stories seemed like the way to go. I've made it through the first 3. So I'm excited to. Well,
are you a fan?
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there. But I thought at least know a little bit what he's talking about.
Yeah, and I think that this book is one of those, as you mentioned, it's short stories, right? So some of them you can get through really quickly. And for me, this hits all of the highs and lows of Stephen King. So if you're out there and you're thinking, I've heard so much about this guy, but I've never really taken the time to read a full book of his, this is such a good sampler to see, would I enjoy that type of writing? Because even the stories that I considered to be, let's say, misses in the world of Stephen King, they were still very, very good. They just didn't hit me like some of the other ones did. So, yeah.
And I think we ought to say we may have a few spoilers in this today.
Oh,
for sure.
I
know that we could try and get by, but really short stories, it's kind of hard to say much of anything without giving a spoiler.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, spoilers are one of those controversial things. I won't get into any of the real plot pieces, but even knowing the feeling of a story when it's only 10 pages long, it really does kind of tell you what's going to happen, or at least gives you some hints. So yeah, definitely some spoilers. So for those that don't want to be or want to be completely surprised, I would maybe come back later.
Yeah. So, all right. What do you think? First story.
First story. So the first story was called Two Talented Bastards, and it's 60 pages. So, all things considered, it's pretty short. For me, this was a story about talent and this curious thing we have where, there are so many talented people that we run into, and sometimes you ask, how did you become so good at what you do? This one's got a little bit of a, cosmic alien spin to it, which is fun. But really the story centers on a writer who has a son, and this son and reporter are more or less curious as to figuring out how this writer and his best friend, who's a world-renowned artist, they came from a small town, and how do two people from a small town magically become so talented?
Yeah, at the same time.
Yeah, at the exact same time. That's quite peculiar, I would say, but yeah, it's a fun story because I think it also ties into real world scenarios where there are a lot of talented people, and sometimes those talented people may not have been given the opportunity to really, let's say, access the talents that they have.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so very, very fun story. I don't know that it was one that it wasn't a page turner for me, but I was curious to see what was happening. And I think that King did a nice job of pulling me along, let's say. Yeah.
I really liked it. I think because I'm not a huge horror fan. And this one wasn't that. It wasn't, not the same as some other stories that would come along.
Yeah, it's a good point. When we think Stephen King, we think of these like big, over-the-top, horrendous, Mom, I know you've watched some of the movies. Like, let's talk about It, right? It's this horrific thing, this scary thing, and it's designed in a way that's meant to like terrify you, right? Build up suspense. But a lot of his books are just like this one, where it's there's a little bit of an otherworldly spin to it. But one thing he does so good is he gives you the opportunity to really know the characters, and you could say, well, that could be me, right? Like I grew up in a small town.
Yeah. I think that's it. I actually could identify with some of those because we are from a small town, and I suppose anyone who's in creative arts would dream of becoming famous someday. I was a family photographer in a tiny little town. I didn't have a lot of opportunities for that to come along. So
yeah, so for me, this one is kind of on that. It's definitely on the upper end of the scale. I would say that it was a 4 out of a 5 if I were to give it a rating. And it sounds like maybe you even enjoyed it a little more than that.
Yeah. I still think my rating would be 4.
Okay.
As far as Stephen King writing, I don't have anything else to compare it to. But as far as a story that I personally liked and enjoyed, I would give it a 4.
Yeah, haven't read it.
Up next. You're up next, yeah. All right, so the second story is one called The Fifth Step, and the title comes from the fifth step of the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step program that everyone's probably heard of. And for those that may not know what that step is, I'll read it for you really quick so we can kind of use it as a reference point. It is admitted to God, to oneself, and to another human being being the key part of this story. We're supposed to admit the exact nature of our wrongs. So the idea that, if we've, done something or we've had ill intent towards someone, that we're going to go tell another person those things that we've done. And this one's a short story.
Yeah.
Yeah, 10 pages.
10
That's
pages.
A quick one. The first 80% of the story, it was written well.
Yeah.
And I wanted to read it. Yeah. I kept reading. I just kept thinking,
it's kind of a feel-good type of story.
Yeah, very feel-good.
That took a big twist. Big twist.
Yeah.
Spoiler.
Yeah. It takes place in Central Park in New York City, and it's two guys sitting on a park bench. That's the whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I mentioned in the fifth step, there's a guy who's there to ask a stranger if he might be willing to listen to some of the things that he's done wrong in his life, and he admits to a little more than the things that he's done wrong in his life. And yeah, at the end, I was surprised.
I was too.
Okay, I went and did a little bit of reading on some online reviews, and I was interested. Some people were like, "Oh, he gave it away halfway through." I was like, "Hold on a second." I went and read it a second time. 10 pages.
Yeah,
you can do that. I don't know where they just knew where he was going
because they knew it was Stephen King.
Right, exactly.
But I didn't feel like he gave it away. I thought, okay, I can see where it's going to get darker, but I didn't see the ending.
Yeah.
The exact ending.
Yeah.
No.
I enjoyed it.
Oh, did you? And I got to the end and I'm like, nope, this isn't for me.
I thought it was a very creative way of. I don't want to spoil too much. I thought it was a very creative way for him to surprise us, but it still felt like the right ending to that story for me.
Yeah.
I don't know how else it would have ended other than to be two gentlemen sitting on a park bench. Yeah. I was pleasantly surprised. I gave this one I gave it a 4 out of 5, and I think these are tough to score because it's 10 pages.
Right.
So for me, it was a 4 out of 5, given that it was a 10-page story.
Yeah, and I probably would agree with that. I personally just don't enjoy that type of content.
Well, here we go.
So there are fans that do, and so I can respect that. But as far as, I loved that. No, I didn't.
Yeah. I thought it was such a good way for him to work in the plot into the title, right? Because the guy is still admitting to something. Yeah. And so I enjoyed it. I liked the way he pieced together the puzzle. The next story we have on the list is called Willie the Weirdo. Did you get to this one?
I did.
You did? Okay.
Yes.
I'm curious what you scored this one before we get into it.
I'm going to say right now, you guys are making me feel like I've really missed out.
Yeah, well, that's why I thought about bringing this over to you yesterday so you could have read these two. They're both 10 pages, right? Yeah. Isn't it another 10-page or 11 pages, something like that? So, yeah.
Maybe you should give it a try, and there can be a little post-episode discussion.
Yes. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Oh.
This one made me feel icky.
Okay, yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, he has a very pictorial writing style. You can absolutely visualize. You can be there in the scene. You can smell. You can see. He also, I feel, has a very matter-of-fact writing style, like to the point. So I can appreciate his writing. Not a story that I enjoyed.
I love that you described it as it made you feel icky, because I think that sometimes that's what people are after, is this kind of like,
yeah,
like what was that about?
If you like to feel icky when you read.
I gave this one a pretty high score. I gave it a 4 out of 5, and maybe that is because I do enjoy Stephen King at his kind of that horrific. And this one, I wouldn't necessarily say this one's horrific. It's more, for me, it was thought provoking. It was, what in the world is going on here? Mm-hmm. And those that have read a lot of Stephen King know that, his characters are memorable. Even just the quote unquote normal characters are memorable. So when he gives you Willie the Weirdo, he's obviously trying to make a point, and he does such a good job developing a character, and to be able to do that in
10 pages.
Yeah,
they're very short story.
Yeah, I've
although it did leave me with some questions.
Oh, well.
Just like,
what in the world?
What in the world type stuff.
Yeah. So the story here centers on this 10-year-old kid, no surprise, named Willie. And he's an odd guy. He's got odd interests. He collects bugs, and not in the way that you go out and collect bugs and like pin them to a board. He wants to take bugs and watch them die.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Sid from Toy Story.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah,
a little bit of
that.
a Sid.
Yep.
But he has this relationship with his grandfather, and his grandfather seems like kind of an odd guy too. The thing that those two bond the most over is they'll spend alone time together, and the grandfather will tell him these very over-the-top stories with tons of detail. But they're historical stories where while you're reading it, you're thinking like, there's no way this guy was in the Civil War and back in ancient Egypt.
Yeah, but he states that he is.
Yeah.
He tells the story as if he was present.
And you're kind of walking through like, oh, the grandfather, he's just so good at telling these made up stories. And then at the end, the grandfather passes away. Maybe.
That's the question.
Right.
Like, what? I'm not really sure what just happened.
Yeah, the thing that Stephen King does really well in the story in terms of trying to give you what the plot is the grandfather has this like tick where he'll rub his upper lip with his finger. And at the end of the story, after the grandfather passes away, Willie comes out of the room and touches his upper lip. Yeah. And so maybe Grandpa was in the Civil War and at Cleopatra's side, and
okay.
And
See,
maybe
I hadn't really
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
okay,
So and
okay.
for someone who has never read Stephen King, there are some previous stories that he's put together with a similar thread of perhaps someone who's lived a little longer than they should have by
gotcha.
yeah. So my end impression for this one was I thought it was the beginning of a good story. I wanted the end of this one to be the start of Willie, right? Because if in fact Willie is a new person,
Does he ever do that? Does he do short stories quite a bit?
he has several collections of short stories and does them really well. In terms of whether he has taken a short story, looked at the response people have had, and then chosen to write new novels, it's tough to answer because a lot of his stories are written in his universe. So you see references to different stories all the time in his novels, and some of those references come up in these short stories as well. But I don't know if there's been like a short story that was the precursor to a bigger, badder plot, and maybe I should know that. So yeah, I liked this one. I wanted to know what Willie was going to do next. I thought the ending was really, really good. And not to use the same number over and over again, but this one was a 4 out of 5 for me as well.
Yeah, I have a hard time even rating it because it was not a story that I loved, but it put me where he was wanting. It was darker.
Yeah.
So if you like it darker, it's one of the stories that
I think it's important. I mean, people, not everyone has to love Stephen King. His genre doesn't have to be something that you enjoy, but he's a good writer, right? He does write. He's written romance novels. He's written happy feel-good stories.
I would not have thought that.
Yeah, one of the stories that you would probably enjoy, Mom, is one called 11/22/63, and it's a time travel story. It's about the assassination of JFK, but really it's a romance story about this man connecting with this woman and not being able to maybe spend the time he wants to with her. And so he jumps genres really well, but at the core, he just writes good characters. So if something good is happening to those characters, it's a feel-good story. But more often than not, you usually feel yourself seeing like, oh no, I don't want this to happen to that character that I feel so connected to. And that's some of the horror that he brings. And does so well. All right, so this next one is it's a doozy. It's 150 pages, which for me, I don't know if I'd call a short story.
Right, and I didn't read this one.
Okay. So it's called Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. For me, it was one of my favorites of the whole collection. I'll give the score right now. I scored it a 4+, and I even had to think about that. I almost thought about rating it a 5, and maybe it was because of the length that I didn't give it that perfect score. But this is a good one. I'm going to read from Stephen King's passage at the end of the book, and he's talking about what his goals were for creating this story, again called Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream. And he proposes some questions. He says, what would happen if a man had a single psychic flash? So, at one time he sees this psychic moment, and this moment shows him where a body is buried. Would you believe him, or would you think that he was the murderer? If he knows where this body is buried, would you believe that it was a psychic flash, or would you think he's the murderer? And the story centers on this kind of back and forth between him, who you assume to be genuine, right, as the reader, and then the detective that is kind of coming after him. But even in that simple back and forth, kind of that stereotypical cat and mouse type of a writing style, there are half a dozen characters that I found myself really enjoying reading about and getting to know, and so he made it feel like real life. But yeah, it was an intense one for me. I was rooting for Danny the whole time. This reminded me a lot of one of Stephen King's previous series called it's the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. It's the Bill Hodges trilogy, where it's a very procedural crime type of a feel to it. But I really, really enjoyed this one. I'm pretty sure I read the entire story in one sit down, which is not too difficult with short stories. But yeah, I would rate this one a 4+. I thought it was really good. I thought it was kind of a classic Stephen King from the last couple of decades. Yeah.
Well, I will be reading it.
Yeah.
I just hadn't gotten to it yet.
Yeah, this one might be one that, if the ick and the kind of intense stuff of Stephen King, if that's something that, is a little bit of a turnoff for you, this is a good one because there's not a lot of, just abrupt scary, what some people might think of as gross
Yeah.
kind of descriptions. This was a good one. I think you'd enjoy it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I might have to try that out.
Yeah, so on to the next one. The next one's called Finn, and Finn was actually released as a standalone short story. I'm not sure how long ago, but if you wanted to read Finn, you could have read it before this collection came out. And it is about a guy with what has to be the worst luck. Have you read this one?
I started it.
You started it,
yeah,
okay.
So I'm in the middle right now.
This will be one of those,
And I'm enjoying it
yeah,
so far.
Yeah, this will be one of those where I won't spoil the end for you because it's, to be honest, it confused me. This one confused me a little bit, which, good, bad, or ugly. Maybe that's what Stephen King was trying to do with this one. But it's about a guy with terrible luck. Like he was dropped on his head as a baby. He's been struck by lightning. Anything that could possibly happen to this guy has happened. And he gets kidnapped on accident.
Right.
So you've gotten to that
There's a
part.
little mix-up, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm there, and he's waking up, or they've played music, and and that's about where I'm at right there.
So the goal, this group of people that's kidnapped Finn, they're interrogating him, and they're doing so with some, we'll call them enhanced techniques. And Finn is trying to convince them, hey, I'm not the guy. Even though he was dressed like the guy and he was in the place that the guy was supposed to be, and all of these, unfortunate events that unfold to put Finn in this situation. And the ending is one where I think he does a nice job of giving you an end point. But I was scratching my head a little bit. What happened was what I kept asking myself. And the reason for that, I'm going to score this one a 3 because I think he had a good idea. And I think the story has some weight to it. But for me, it just didn't end in a way that was satisfying. And yeah, maybe that was his goal. I don't know. So I'm interested to hear what you think about it when you get through it. The next story is called On Slide In Road. Again, another 20-page story. I take it that since you're in the middle of Finn, you haven't made it any further.
Right, that's where I'm at.
Perfect. So On Slide In Road, this was a fun one. I enjoyed this one. It's about a family. They're out on a road trip. They're going to visit a family member that's sick. And so, that part of it's, that can feel real. I think we've all been in a situation where we're on a road trip, but maybe the reason we're on the road trip isn't so enjoyable. But this family, it's a grandfather, his son, and then his son's family. So there's a mom and dad and then 2 kids. And they take this shortcut. And the shortcut is on Slide In Road. And this road it's weathered and it's old, and they run into some road trouble, and they meet these unsavory characters, and kind of chaos ensues. It's kind of, roadside robbery style story. And this one ends in the best way. There's an unsurprising character comes to save the day. You get to see kind of this courage versus cowardice kind of plot play out. And for me, this was a story about different generations and how, the kids are, playing video games and focused on things that, kids are focused on. And the parents are, kind of gripey in the front seat and complaining about having to take the grandpa across the way and et cetera. And the grandpa's this, this Vietnam vet who's just kind of, casually in the car. And you see kind of those personalities unfold as they get into this trouble. And I really enjoyed this one. I'd score it around a 3+, I think is where I'd put it. I don't think it had enough weight to go into that 4 category, but I enjoyed this one. I thought it was fun.
Sounds like a good one. Yeah.
The next one's called Red Screen, and we're taking a dive down, unfortunately. The next couple, I kind of found myself in a lull while I was reading these. But Red Screen is about a detective who interviews a guy who just frankly admits to killing his quote-unquote wife. And the reason I say quote is because this guy claims that his wife was no longer his wife. She was someone else. I'll let those who are listening interpret that however they want, and hopefully you'll go read the story and have an opinion of your own. But this guy who's killed this person tells the detective, here are the telltale signs of when your wife turns into this other person. And it's stuff like, she becomes naggy and picky and all of these, kind of stereotypes get put forward. And, the detective, of course, is going home to his wife who's maybe being a little picky about things and nagging him about a few things. And at the end of the story, they try to give you a little bit of a thought-provoking moment. But for me, it just didn't really hit me the way I wanted it to.
For you.
Yeah, it was okay. I scored this one a 2. If I was reading this and just wanted to skip the bad ones, this is one that I might skip. But yeah, not for me. I think it feels like it falls flat. All right. The next story in this collection is called The Turbulence Expert. This one seemed like an idea that Stephen King had hidden in a closet somewhere, and he pulled it out and said, I'm going to throw this in this book. I didn't see this as a story, really, more than it was just a short little description of an idea he might have. And if he turns it into a book, I'm sure it will be great. But for me, this was just kind of meh. The plot is a guy who's on a plane with a special job. He kind of makes sure that the plane gets where it's going when there's bad weather. That's the general, without giving away too many spoilers. And this job apparently comes with a price. And so you're kind of left with, trying to understand why he's taken the job and what the job really entails. And he tries to recruit someone else to do the job. And that was really it, unless I completely missed the point of the story. So for me, this was, again, a score of a 2. It's well written. I've not read a Stephen King story that I thought that was poorly written. But for me, there was no plot. There really was no story arc. More of just an unfinished idea. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, for those that want to experience Stephen King, maybe this is one you want to read because, again, he develops the character. You do want to read the story. But yeah, this one fell pretty flat for me as well. After that is a story called Lori. Lori is the name of a dog, and there's a widower who, after his wife dies, he's given this dog as a gift from his sister as kind of a way to, have something to care for and keep him occupied while he's living alone and in retirement, etc. And it's really just kind of a feel-good story about him getting to know and learning to love this dog who he starts to take everywhere with him. And, I think there's probably 100 stories out there that are similar to this, but there isn't a piece at the end
that gets... There's got to be a but.
There's always a Stephen King but ... There's a little excitement at the end. This is one that I think, Laisha, you would enjoy.
Okay.
There's nothing crazy. It's just at the end you're like, ooh, wow, that was exciting. So yeah, I gave it a 3+. I think people will tend to notice that I'm scoring the ones with the quote unquote ick a little higher than the feel good stories. But again, well written. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. One of the themes of this book is kind of that getting older. And Stephen King is, I think, 76 years old, so he's getting older. And so you wonder, how much of his perspective is going into some of these books. But yeah, it's a nice story. I thought it was really well written. I would read it again and would recommend it. Yeah. Okay, so the last 3 stories, for me, I thought that the order, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but for me, this collection of stories kicked off with some good ones, and then the last 3 for me were, man, I liked all of them, and I rated all of them accordingly. So this next one's called Rattlesnakes, and anyone that's read previous Stephen King books, there's a story called Cujo, and some people call Rattlesnakes like a sequel to Cujo. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a sequel, more so than the characters are in this story as well. So you get to kind of see some what's happened later on in one of the characters. And specifically, it's the husband that is in Cujo. And I'll kind of end that there for those that haven't read it. But it's about a grieving widower who he takes a vacation to Florida. And he's staying in his friend's house on the beach in Florida as a way to kind of get over the loss of his wife. And he meets a very interesting character, and he inherits something very unexpected. And I'm not going to give too many more plot points. I think this is a good enough story that for those that want to read it, I really don't want to spoil too much. If you like ghost stories, and you like, again, you're laughing.
Well, we did read The September House. That made me think of that.
Oh, yeah. No. So this, as far as like crazy goes, and I've not read The September House, but my wife has. As far as crazy goes, this one's not crazy in that way, but it's got a really well-described kind of haunting piece to it. So it's not icky. There's no, really high depicted stuff. I take that back entirely.
I'm like, it's Stephen King.
Yeah,
I think there probably has to be.
I'm jogging my memory. The two things this story does excellent is it's got a great haunting piece to it, but then there is one paragraph or two where some body horror is described in a classic Stephen King way.
Yeah.
And it is, I mean, it can be disturbing without a doubt. So maybe you get there and skip that part. Although
I'll read it.
Yeah.
I do. I read it. Sometimes then maybe I wish I hadn't, but I'll do it.
This one, for me, it's a basket of different emotions and things. For this, it was sad at times. You got people going through grief, right? Multiple people grieving in different ways. There's a heartwarming element to it. There's some happy parts. The ending was really exciting. All over the place in terms of where Stephen King takes you with this one. But the disturbing imagery really sticks with me. I give this one a 4+. I thought it was really excellent. It was not a page turner in that it was exciting, but when something was meant to be scary, I was apprehensive to turn the page. And when things were meant to be horrific, I was horrified. So I thought it was really good. Yeah, I thought it was really good. The next story is called The Dreamers. And this story is about a Vietnam vet with what some people might describe as a photographic memory. And so he's able to, listen to what someone says and be able to recall it perfectly. And so he takes a job as a stenographer for a scientist. So this scientist is doing these strange experiments, and his job is just to annotate what's happening, right? Who says what's happening at what time, and he's really good at this job. But this scientist, he has an interesting expertise, which is that he studies dreams, and the experiments, they get pretty crazy. Yeah, so for me, this one had that very Lovecraft cosmic horror feel. I would score this one at a 4. I almost gave it the 4+. I don't know why I didn't want to give it the 4+. I think some people enjoyed this one a little more than I did. But it reminds me of a recent book that Stephen King wrote called Revival. And I did really enjoy Revival. So for me, maybe it just didn't quite get to the level that I wanted it to with that book. But Stephen King, he has this interesting afterword where he references this short story in particular. And he's talking about this stenographer who's, writing things down and being able to visualize things before he writes them down. And Stephen King kind of compares himself to that stenographer where, he's just writing what he sees in his mind. And I think Stephen King, clearly his mind is filled with tons of ideas, and he's just writing them down for us to read at any time. So, yeah, I thought this was a really good one. Again, I gave it a 4 out of a 5. So the last story in this collection is called The Answer Man. And The Answer Man is, for me, it was one of my favorites. I scored it a 5 out of 5. If you like short stories, this is a good one. And as far as Stephen King and his writing goes, this is one that I think that you two would really enjoy. There's not a lot of that horror element to it, but there is that kind of grandiose looking back on life. He develops the character so well. When the character goes through some emotions, you feel those emotions. Just a really, really good story. And it's about a recent Harvard law grad who has some really important decisions to make, some life-changing decisions. He has to decide where he's going to start his law practice. He has to decide, where he's going to live, and his marriage and his family and all of these important, life-altering things are kind of contingent upon these questions. And he goes looking for answers, and he gets some answers from, as the title might suggest, a guy who calls himself the Answer Man. This story for me was exciting in all the right parts, but then just kind of nice and casual through some of the more the parts where you're connecting with the character. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy story where this guy is looking for answers in his life, and he gets given answers, and it makes you wonder, did he do things in a way to make those answers come true because he knew they were going to happen? Or was the Answer Man really giving him what he knew was going to be true in the future? And really fun story. There's a scene where he sits down with the Answer Man, and the Answer Man, he pulls out this clock. And the deal is, if you want answers from the Answer Man, you have to pay a certain amount of money for a certain amount of time. And you get to ask any question you want. The only word you can't use is the word should. So should I do this or should I do that? And there was one part where, as simple as this is, the ticking clock made me like, hurry up, ask more questions, get as much as you can. Stephen King does a good job of, as a reader, you think you know what's going to happen next, and then he kind of pulls it, and you're like, oh, maybe that's not what's going to happen. And then he'll sting you on the back end, and, he'll flip it on its head. And so there is a little bit of that, Kingism style of writing. But King says he wrote the first pages of this story when he was 30 years old, which I mentioned earlier. He's 76. It was almost 45 years ago.
Wow.
So this one got kind of pulled out of the file cabinet. And I think he says one of his friends or close colleagues said, hey, you got to finish this one. This is a good one. And I agree. I scored it a 5 out of 5. It's just a really fun look back on life, the regrets that someone might have when things go wrong or they don't take a certain path. And then also some of the good things that can come out of, the joys of different decisions that you make. And so for me, this was a good one. If someone wanted to pick up You Like It Darker by Stephen King, this is one that I would not skip, or at least make it to the end.
Yeah. I'm excited. I'm excited to read it.
Yeah, I think you're going to enjoy most of these stories. I think that some of them may not be your cup of tea.
Yeah.
But I think you'll appreciate them. And hopefully he writes a new novel soon. He does a good job of kicking out a couple a year for us that really enjoy reading.
I think, is Holly the last one?
Holly is maybe the most recent novel, yeah. And I've read it. It's a good one. So yeah, what is your favorite Stephen King? Which one scared you the most when you were a kid?
So my friend Jude and I, we would sit on our couch at my house and we watched Children of the Corn. And I just remember having my head covered. Well, both of our heads were covered in the Afghan because it was so scary. We didn't want to watch, but yet we did want to watch. But maybe that's why I've not read his books, because I was terrified.
I think some people maybe don't realize the impact Stephen King has had on the film industry, right? If you think about like The Shining, some of those Pet Sematary.
Pet
Sematary.
I saw
good
that
one. Yes.
I saw that in the theaters, and I did watch it like with my hands over my eyes, peeking through.
Yes.
Covering your ears.
I'm going to do that thing that people do and tell you that the book is better.
And it is. I'm sure. Always.
Yeah, I read that. I read Pet Sematary just a couple of years after our oldest daughter was born. And I'll say as a parent, that one's, it's like, again, back to his ability to give you a character that you resonate with. I hated reading that book, and I thought it was one of the best books I've ever read. So, kind of did that thing to me. But yeah, Stephen King movies, it's interesting because you can visualize the horror aspects more so, right? So they can make them bigger and better and crazier. But there's something about that slow kind of, he gives you a lot of room with your imagination to think about what's going to happen next and how many pages do I have to get through before I find out what's next. Yeah. So yeah.
You've intrigued me. Yeah. I will be reading this book.
Good. I think it's a good one. And hopefully it spurs you to read some of the classic Stephen King's.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Shane, for coming. We really enjoyed your summaries. I thought your reviews were excellent. And I am excited to finish the rest of the stories in the book.
And come back and see us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Next time we'll have to do a bigger fantasy story. That's kind of the other genre that I enjoy a lot. And maybe next year.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm excited for our next episode, Lainey.
It's our first Little's Library episode.
Yes, and we'll have another special guest.
Miss Lila will be in the barn.
Yes, Lila, my little 4-year-old granddaughter. Tune in for that special episode and make sure that you like, share, subscribe.
Head to our Facebook page.
Yes, all that good stuff. And we'll see you next time. I'm Laisha.
And I'm Lainey.
And keep those bookmarks busy.